in 2 churches in Birmingham, Alabama, as well as a supply, preaching, and interim pastor. After living and studying in Scotland, he taught for 2 years at Seattle Pacific University. He came to Truett Theological Seminary of Baylor University in the fall of 2007, where he teaches Introduction to Christian History, Christian Texts and Traditions 1, which is covering the early church, as well as other theological electives. He's written a number of books. His most recent one is The Gospel According to Heresy. He is currently also co-editing a 5-volume series on the reception of Paul in the early church. You want to go ahead and give us a wave?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Our third panelist this morning is Dr. Jeffrey Bingham. He received his PhD from Dallas Theological Seminary. He is the Associate Dean of Biblical and Theological Studies and the Professor of Theology at Wheaton College. He is a part of the American Academy of Religion, the American Historical Association, the American Society of Church History, along with a number of other groups, as well as the Southwest Seminar on the Development of Early Catholic Christianity. His most recent book is, well, a few books. One of them is on Irenaeus' use of the gospel, pocket history of the church, and a couple others. So, you want to go ahead and give us the wave real quick?
Morning.
And our fourth panelist is Dr. Paul Hartog. He received his PhD from Loyola University. He is regarded as an authority in the field of early church history and has published numerous articles and a major book. He is also involved in local church ministry as a youth pastor. Students appreciate how he uses a thorough biblical perspective to his history, ethics, and philosophy classes. He and his family live in Des Moines and are members of Maranatha Baptist Church in Grimes, Iowa. He recently wrote a book entitled Polycarp's Epistles to the Philippians and the Martyrdom of Polycarp. Want to give us a...
Hello, good to be with you.
Welcome. Thank you all for being with us today. I'm going to go ahead and ask Dr. Kruger to start us off.
Happy to start us off. Help me understand how you want me to begin. I'll be happy to share with you what you would like to have me begin with.
If you'd just like to give us a breakdown of just your book, essentially, kind of some of your theories behind it, and perhaps just a short summary of your whole work.
Yeah, happy to give a little background here. This book is now 5 years old. We published it in 2010. Andreas Kostenberger and I have been doing a number of things together for a few years with the PhD seminar at Southeastern Baptist Seminary where he teaches, and I was helping him out with some of those seminars with his students. And over time, it became clear that there was a lot of discussion around what's known as the Bauer Thesis, and this is old news, of course, for those of us in the world of New Testament studies. But for the students, this was a fascinating journey for them in terms of figuring out who Walter Bauer was and what he taught. For your students there, no doubt you know about Walter Bauer's famous book on Heresy and Orthodoxy and early Christianity. Bauer, of course, wrote during the 1930s in Germany, relatively unknown at the time, but it wasn't until his book was published in English, I think it's 1971, that he was sort of made a big splash on the Western scene, particularly the American scene. And Bauer's thesis sort of dominates biblical studies today. A little bit ironic, given the fact that large chunks of it have been relatively challenged over the years and arguably much of it refuted. Either way, Bauer's thesis basically has many parts to it, but the essence of it is a claim that early Christianity was wildly diverse in its theologies. There was no early Christianity per se, just early Christianities, plural, each group fighting it out for supremacy and the right to claim to be the true Christian teaching. And so what Bauer argued is that in some locales, the earliest form of Christianity was actually what was later deemed to be a heretical form of Christianity, and that Orthodoxy was a little bit late on the scene. So what Bauer does is flips things around contrary to the normal way we think. We tend to think that Orthodoxy is first and heresy is a deviant form of it that comes later. Bauer instead argued that no, in the beginning it was all kinds of views, what we later would call heresy and Orthodoxy side by side. And it wasn't until later, probably in the 4th century and beyond, that someone won the theological wars and declared themselves to be true Christianity. And so, says Bauer, in essence, the Christianity that you believe, the Christianity that you follow, is just the Christian view of the theological victors and isn't necessarily normative or true. And that we are obligated as scholars to go back and find those who lost those theological debates to see if they have a valid claim on truth as well. Now, that paradigm fits the modern pluralistic world quite well. And so Andreas and I wrote the book to address the way that historical studies now reflect a commitment to pluralism, just like our modern culture. And Bauer's thesis embodies that quite clearly. A number of scholars today still tout Bauer and still use Bauer's main theses, even though parts of it have been refuted. And we wrote the book to try to continue to push back against some of those movements. The book is, in essence, divided into 3 parts. The beginning deals with sort of diversity with early Christianity. The second deals with the origins of the New Testament canon. And the third deals with the transmission of the New Testament text. And any of those areas I'd be happy to discuss. I want to say hello to my friend Jeff Bingham, who I see on the line there. Jeff was kind enough to review this book at an ETS session years ago. And here we are again, Jeff, a chance to talk even more about it.
Yeah, it's good to see you, buddy.
So there's my quick overview. I don't want to spend the whole time talking, so there's a quick summary, and hopefully we springboard from that into further conversations.
Chase, if you can hear me, my advice would be all the students have read the book. You can launch probably straight into questions, but give the panelists maybe a first opportunity to respond or ask questions.
Yes. Dr. Will Haidt, I believe your view is a little bit different. We'd love to hear your side of this discussion, please.
Sure. Well, first, again, thanks for having me here, and let me thank Dr. Kruger, who I've not met in person, but for his work. Not only this work he co-authored with Dr. Kostenberger, but also his other work. I know of you by reputation. So you're a great scholar, and I appreciate what you're doing here. I think I probably ought to situate where I fit in this conversation, because when I first read this book, I deeply sympathize with the conclusions of this book. I think I'm an ally to Dr. Kruger. But Dr. Kruger is really laying all the blame at the feet of Walter Bauer's thesis, and I use Walter Bauer's thesis in my own research, and so there I felt not like an ally but an enemy. And so I think it's worth me unpacking that just a minute, just so that if there are questions or if the conversation goes on, we'll all know where we're coming from on this. When I hear Bart Ehrman go on to NPR, onto cable comedy shows, news shows, I feel a deep sense of frustration with Ehrman, because you get the feeling from hearing him talk that all New Testament scholars, all early Christian scholars agree with him, and anyone who disagrees with Ehrman's conclusions is not a scholar at all, but is simply a person of faith, not using their brain. I'm sure Ehrman doesn't mean to say it this way, but this is how it feels when you listen to him. And so when I read Dr. Kruger's work, I felt that same sense of frustration with Ehrman and Elaine Pagels and others who are taking this conversation into kind of pop media. So there, I think I completely agree. His strongest work here is especially in talks about the canon at the end of this work. Again, where I think my methodology differs is I just wouldn't lay all the blame of this on the Bauer thesis. So again, I think maybe just my approach is one where I think it is helpful to begin with this idea that there was diversity in the early church. And again, I don't think it's as widely diverse as the impression you get from listening to Ehrman and others and their popular works. In fact, I don't think Walter Bauer is actually quoted anywhere in Dr. Kruger's book. Maybe I missed it. I tried to look back through for it. I thought it's worth actually quoting Walter Bauer's thesis. This is from his preface of his 1934 work, translated in 1979. Here is Bauer. I'll read it. Quote, "Perhaps, I repeat, perhaps," that's his emphasis, not mine, "certain manifestations of Christian life that the authors of the church renounce as heresies originally had not been such at all, but at least here and there were the only form of the new religion. That is, for those regions, they were simply Christianity." End quote. So I think that's a much more humble hypothesis that Bauer gives us, even if the Bart Ehrmans and the Elaine Pagels take Bauer and run wild in some directions. And the reason I think that's helpful to start there is because I think when, again, a lot of Christians, a lot of students hear things in pop media, there is almost this this culture war that immediately kicks in, that I think we, especially we who come from an evangelical background, are prone to, where it's us against them and they're attacking us, our faith. And I get that. I sympathize with that. I'm not sure I want to play into that hand, though, because, for example, when I was teaching in Seattle to undergrads a few years ago, the Gospel of Judas had just been released by National Geographic in an English translation. And I had a line of students coming to my office scared that this was undermining our faith. And that's actually very easy to address. We simply pulled up the Gospel of Judas and read it for ourselves. And it turns out the Gospel of Judas is obviously written centuries later. No one thinks it's actually written by Judas. And the things in there are clearly intentionally meant to be mysterious and esoteric. I mean, this is worlds away from the four canonical Gospels. So I think if we were to just accept Bauer's thesis that there is diversity within early Christianity, we can overcome that us versus them mentality, that kind of fear of the unknown, of fear of diversity in early Christianity, and we can actually learn a lot from these texts. The Gospel of Judas and other Gospels, apocryphal Gospels, aren't going to tell us anything about the historical Jesus, but they are going to tell us a lot about the diversity within early historical Christianity. And I'm not going to agree with the Gospel of Judas's view. I doubt anybody in this panel would, or in this room would. But I think we have a lot more to learn simply by starting with reading these texts on a case-by-case basis. So, again, I don't think I disagree with Dr. Kruger's conclusions. I simply thought it was worth spelling out the methodology that I actually sympathize with, even though I do sympathize with what he's trying to do in this book. So I want to thank him for his work, and again, thanks for letting me be a part of this.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Would either of the other two or three panel members like to speak on that for a moment?
I'm wondering. Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, just a quick comment or two before the other panelists chime in. I mean, much of what was said just there, I have very little disagreement with. By way of clarification, it's probably worth noting that our book was written more as a critique of modern manifestations of the Bauer thesis than a revisiting back to his original, 1934 work. No doubt that people in the modern day have taken Bauer and probably run a little further with it than maybe he himself would have done, which is typical of these sorts of things. So that's an important clarification. And the other clarification I would offer that nowhere in the book or other writings do we deny the existence of diversity within early Christianity. In fact, I covered this a good bit in other places in my writings where I talk about the nature of early Christian diversity and the fact that it is there. And much of my own scholarship in other places is actually on apocryphal literature and early apocryphal gospels, and so there's no doubt there's diversity there. The question is what you conclude from that diversity. Modern scholars often look at that diversity and conclude, therefore, there cannot be any one normative view of Christianity, and it's that second step that we take issue with in the book. And so it's not a denial of diversity, although it is a denial of the extent of diversity, which we think is vastly overplayed. Regardless, there still is diversity, and that's certainly something I teach my students and something we all have to acknowledge, given the fact that it's there in the historical sources. So those are a couple clarifications by words.
Thank you for that. Dr. Bingham, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Just that I think what we're hearing this morning is a unity around the way in which the Bauer thesis has been employed in contemporary theological agendas, and let's call them precisely what they are. These are theological agendas, also closely aligned with ethical and social agendas, all of which have found Bauer to be an ally in promoting what are obviously a set of theological, sociological, and ethical concerns which are near and dear to elements of the academy in this time in our lives. One of the most important statements that I think is made in the book by Kruger and Kostenberger is that they readily acknowledge and put out there for everyone to see that there is clearly an anti-supernatural bias operating in the way in which contemporary scholars employ the Bauer Thesis, or should I say in some cases exploit the Bauer Thesis. This is not a war of objectivity. This isn't a cultural conflict in objectivity where you have the idealistic historian who is looking at data in an objective, bias-free, unprejudicial manner. The quote-unquote historians on both sides of the issue are arriving at the data with certain assumptions, certain theological assumptions with which they are engaging the data. And so when the contemporary group of scholars that exploit Bauer in the way in which some present scholarship is doing so, and they claim to be doing this on an objective, bias-free basis, which quote-unquote simply follows the data wherever it leads, we need to recognize that this certainly is not the case, and that data can be managed and interpreted to suit an individual's or a community's sociological, ethical, or theological concerns. And so to round it off here, when Kostenberger and Kruger bring to the fore a recognition of an anti-supernatural bias, I think this is one of the greatest gifts that they could have given, not only to evangelical scholarship, but to hopefully awaken and to bring to a position of honesty other scholars who would not associate themselves with the evangelical community. So, Michael, it's my opportunity again to thank you and your co-author for this work and for the important perspectives that you bring forth through it.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much for that. Dr. Hartog, do you have anything you'd like to add to this discussion this morning?
I think there's a couple issues that are kind of being hinted on or in some ways directly pointed to. I think that Dr. Wilhite has brought up an interesting question about the Bauer/Ehrman. So like in the phrase Bauer-Ehrman thesis, even in my own work at times, I think I kind of too much have conflated those kind of sides of the hyphen, and to kind of think through the historical development of some of those and to think of them in kind of separate kind of categories. And going back to the Bauer part of it, I think we could begin to maybe do is think through some further divisions there. So we have the statement of diversity, which Dr. Wilhite brought up, and I think we would all agree with the concept of diversity. I think I would divide that even further into questions of majority and priority that I was trying to argue in some locations, groups that were later tagged with a very specific, titled Heresy, let's say, were the majority in those locations, and also that in some locations they were the first ones there. I think it would be a mistake for those of a more traditional mindset, and I would put myself in that same category, to think that in and of themselves those types of statements are problematic. So let's give an example much further later in history. I think we would all agree probably that Arian missionaries were the first ones to go up into, let's say, Slavic countries, and there's nothing that's questioning that would cause one to question historic Christianity simply because, as I would tend to see that, simply because Arian missionaries were the first ones in Slavic countries. I think the other term besides diversity, whether we're talking about majority or priority, is the question of normativity. And I think that's where kind of the difficulty enters if the Bauer thesis is used in a manner that says because there's diversity, therefore there can't be a sense of normativity. And there's all kinds of difficulties. I don't think at this point I'll get into that. I mean, we have questions about historical events and interpretation events. Clearly there could be multiple interpretations of the same event, but the event is a singular event, for example, and that's one question to kind of put on the table. The other one is the question even of linguistics, concept versus term. So to bring up a later historical question, in the Lutheran tradition, you have those who would wonder if Melanchthon changes Martin Luther, let's say. So, what's the true Lutheranism by the mid-1500s? There are ways of trying to answer that, looking at historical documentation, but we shouldn't be surprised that there's diversity of interpretations that arise from singular figures and singular historical events. I think the question is, issues of normativity are the ways of deciding if someone in fact has the wrong interpretation.
Thank you very much. Would any other panelists like to jump in and add any of their comments before we go to questions?
Let me just offer greetings to Paul. Paul, I'm not sure you and I have met face-to-face before, but I appreciated your work over the years, particularly have used it in the area of Polycarp, obviously, and just wanted to offer a greeting to you now that we're on a screen together.
Thank you.
So one question, just to start us off before I open it up for the other students. What sort of things would you say were accepted widely as essentially orthodoxy, saying that we did begin with some sort of orthodox things that people did agree with when we look when we see the Arians or other heretical groups who clearly are not Christian? What sort of things were the foundational things that started Christianity?
And Chase, anyone can respond to these. Anyone on the panel can respond to any of these questions.
Yes, anyone can respond.
Could I ask for the question to be repeated, please?
Yeah, so what were the foundational Christian beliefs when we do look at like the Arians or groups that we do now consider true heresies? What were some of these debatable things in the early Christian church or things that were not debated in the early Christian church in order to even be considered Christianity?
Well, I'll start with one, and by the way, everything was debated in the early church, and so on one level, that just needs to be thrown out there. The question isn't whether someone somewhere disagrees. The question is whether there's any reason to think that view had the majority or was a minority position. And so there's lots of different theological loci we could mention here. One thing I think was normative from the very start for early Christians, truthfully, was just the use and the value of the Old Testament narrative. Christians from the very beginning were committed to the Old Testament not only as the Word of God, but committed to understanding the story of Jesus within the context of the story of Israel and the story that God had begun in the Old Testament. And of course we know that Christians at some points varied off that path. The most obvious being Marcion himself. Others did the same. But the idea of Christianity's link to Judaism, I think, was one of the essential foundational starting points for the faith, and something that we can trace all the way back to our earliest sources. So there's just one example, if you're open-ended question of the type of things early Christians affirmed from the start that we would consider an orthodox belief.
Yeah, so it gets very basic to the issues of historiography. Early Christians were extremely interested in the question of historiography. How is history to be interpreted? How is history to be understood? So is there a unity between the past and the present? Is there a unity to be seen between Jews and Christians? Is there a unity to be seen between the incarnation and the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus Christ? How are we to interpret stories about miracle in history? Are these to be understood as symbolic? Are these to be understood in a mythical way? Are these to be understood in a historical and earthly and mundane fashion? What are we to do with the entire question of language about the future, about a future coming of God? Is this to be understood as something which is to be experienced only in the present in a non-literal fashion, or is this something that is to be understood essentially as eschatological in a very literal fashion? How are we to understand language about the flesh of Christ? Is this symbolic language? Is this literal language? And so most of the questions that are being asked in the period of what we might designate early Christianity are questions that revolve around how are we to understand the flow of history? How are we to understand the question of the mundane and the earthly, particularly in relationship to the heavenly and the spiritual? Is there a unity between the heavenly and the spiritual? And so these questions are fundamentally about how are we to understand stories about events that take place within history but are instigated from outside of history. Much of the issues center around the question of the interpretation of historical matters. The Gnostics, the Valentinians, the Sethians will give one set of answer to those. The Orthodox will give another set of answers to those. Marcion will give a different set of answers to those, some in common with the Valentinians. But these are the issues which are central for believers and for those who will depart from the church in the first, second, and third centuries.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. So our first question comes from Braden. If you want to come on down.
Hello. Dr. Kruger, I want to thank you for your work. I can honestly say that I do believe the Heresy of Orthodoxy is probably the best academic source that I've read as far as carrying forward for a book on apologetics or just strengthening my education. So my question just goes, just coming from the middle of your book, how does one communicate the connection between the Old and New Testament based on the God of covenants? Just kind of coming, if you're going to talk to someone who thinks that the God of the Old Testament is this God of hatred, but then wanting just to communicate, no, like he's a God of covenants, and we see this in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and just kind of elaborating on that.
Thank you for your question. I think I'm trying to understand the question about the unity between the covenants, between the God of the Old Covenant and the God of the New Covenant. The section in my book you might be referring to is a section where I talk about how the concept of covenant plays an enormous role in understanding why we have a new one. That when God establishes a covenant, they typically are associated with written texts, just like when God gave the covenant at Mount Sinai, he gave it in a written form. Therefore, if God inaugurates a new covenant with Jesus, it would also come in a written manifestation. And this leans heavily on the work of Meredith Kline and others about the unity between those two things. But you also mentioned this issue of whether the God of the Old Covenant and the God of the New Covenant are different gods. I think that may be part of where your question is lying. That gets a little bit at the point I was making a moment ago, is that early Christians were very committed to the idea of a unity between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New. In fact, in many ways, they saw Jesus as the manifestation in the flesh, of course, of the Old Testament God. And so there is a great amount of unity between the two. Sometimes we can look at the Old Testament and get this impression that the Old Testament's a God of wrath and the New Testament is a God of mercy. But truthfully, that is, in my opinion, a very cursory look at the two Testaments. There's many, many places in the Old where God is incredibly gracious and merciful. Many places in the New where Jesus and New Testament context indicate that God is still a very holy God. In fact, when God identifies himself to Moses in the Old Testament, he goes out of his way to identify himself as a God of patience and mercy and long-suffering. This is something I think helps us establish the unity between the two covenants as well. So what you see in the development of the New Covenant, and this is a point I make in the book, is that the New Covenant really should be viewed as the finishing of a prior story. The New Covenant as something, entirely new, as if it's just a brand new literary work. But the writers themselves and the early church saw it as the completion of something that had already started before. And so what you have, in one sense, is in the Old Testament, you have a play without a final act. It's almost like you have a 4-act play, and everyone's waiting for it to have the 5th and final act, and the New Testament comes along and offers that 5th and final act. And so you really realize that all the Old and New together are one single, unified story of redemption.
Excellent, thank you. Aaron.
Hi, my name's Erin Ramsey. I think my question might be slightly outside of the scope of this conversation, but as it could be advantageous for the students in this class, I figured I'd ask it for any of the panelists that would like to respond. And my question is, considering my understanding of Ehrman's own background as involving evangelical biblical education, what questions, specifically philosophical questions, would any of the panelists recommend students at Moody begin wrestling with while here under the guidance of our professors to avoid propagating circular arguments of relativism from being confronted with them post-graduation?
Panelists can jump in and speak to that.
I can maybe start us off with that. I don't know that I have the exact answer that your question is addressing, because I'm not quite sure I heard the end of your question, or maybe I misheard it. Something seemed to kind of bleep in my ear. But if you're asking about kind of philosophical commitments and how those might be challenged as you explore these issues deeper, especially in a grad study kind of environment, I suspect the major item that the church is wrestling with today, and Christians are wrestling with today, is the fact that we're in a post-foundationalist world. And Bart Ehrman, I always am reluctant to psychologize other people and trying to get into their head of what they were thinking, but it's commonly pointed out that Bart Ehrman, if I remember correctly, I think he went to Moody Bible Institute, but he certainly comes from a very conservative Christian background, as do I, and I'm not beginning there as a fault to any conservative view, but the idea that we can start with the pure foundation of the Bible and our theology, I think this is the real danger, is the theology that we build as Christians is simply proof texting. Now, I'm not saying anyone did that to Bart Ehrman. I don't know for sure. I can, from my own experience, this is the kind of theology I was given very young, and even in my early college years. And then when you go and study the Scripture historically and critically, and you start to get the rug pulled out from under your feet, I think it's just too easy for some people to say, oh, well, if the foundation of my understanding of what the Bible was, I thought of this as a modern bound book dropped straight out of heaven. When you have that pulled out from under you, I think it's too easy to flounder around for some other foundation. My question for Bart Ehrman would be, he seems to be just as much a foundationalist, only instead of going to the right in conservative theology, he went to the far left in philosophically. So I think that as we wrestle with the fact that we are always dealing with people's interpretations, even our church's interpretation, which I think is a reliable interpretation, but we are struggling as Christians today in a post-foundationalist world, and I think that's okay. Whenever we read in the Bible about our foundation, the foundation of our faith is never put in some philosophical construct. The foundation of our faith is never put in some commitment we have, some doctrine we have. Our foundation of our faith is always in Christ and the Spirit of Christ who leads us into all truth. So I don't think that this post-foundationalist, postmodern world we're in is scary, but I do think that's the kind of philosophical struggle that most Christians are going to have as they move into the kind of world you're talking about.
I had a question related to this to Dr. Kruger, to Mike, to see if can give me some insight on this. In hearing the talk so far already, there's one panelist had mentioned kind of some sides issue, and I wonder on the historiography side, I don't think it's as simple as sides. On some philosophical facets, I think that's where it's clear you get into some law of non-contradiction issues, like either there can be miracles in history, there can be miracles, the resurrection can happen or it can't happen type of side. So then what we find collapsing together is some apologetic issues and some historical issues, it seems to me. I found it interesting, the first student, I think it was Braden or Brandon, had mentioned he thought it was the best apologetic work as well as historical work. And I was reading through your book again this morning, Dr. Kruger, and it just brings up interesting apologetic philosophical questions, because stating against, say, a Bart Ehrman that not being open to the possibility of the miraculous, it's a kind of a theological critique. Of course, he himself wouldn't find that, it wouldn't probably inch him much in his own view. I think we'd probably agree with that. And so then I'm even wondering, this kind of gets into issues related to your book. It's a book of history, but it also brings up questions about apologetic method. It seems to me it's more of a presuppositionalist kind of a background. I mean, you don't use that word per se, a Vantillian type of a background. I think I would agree with you on issues of self-authentication of the scriptures as it relates to canon, but not, and I don't think you would either. I think we'd agree that you have to trace how that works through history, so the historical evidence adds to that view of self-authentication as far as the early church's own primary sources talk about agreeing with certain texts being in the canon because of how they were edifying and how they used in public worship, and then, so they're recognizing that. But I guess to kind of whittle down my question, how do you see moving forward the philosophical apologetic side in a way that is beckoning toward people that one disagrees with? It seems like we're coming to impasses here in the historiography side, but really the impasses are in the philosophical worldview side. Does that last question kind of make sense of narrowing it down? And how do we move forward?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'll try to sort of make some comments on that. I think the way to move forward in this debate with people like Bart Ehrman is not just by keeping the discussion to what you might call the bare facts. Ehrman tends to think that you can just look at the bare facts and reach conclusions, but one of the things we tried to point out in the book was that everybody comes from a certain worldview, have a certain perspective, and Jeff Bingham a minute ago brought up that point, that we try in the book to show that it's not just historical facts as if they're self-interpreting, they're interpreted through a worldview. And if you're going to make progress in the debate in our culture today with with historical issues, you've got to look at historical issues at the fact level and at the worldview level, both, because both matter. The fact level certainly matters because you want to be proficient in and well versed in the facts of history, but the worldview level is the thing that interprets those facts, and those two have to both be considered if you're gonna debate or argue with folks about the truth of Christianity. And so what I've tried to do, not just in this book, but in my other reviews of Bart Ehrman and the other times I've interacted with Ehrman in print, is to back up the question one notch away from just, which book was cited as scripture in the 2nd century and things like this, to a larger question about worldviews and the way you approach history and the way you view moral norms in the universe and things like this. Because you'll find that Ehrman's worldview ends up having a lot of inconsistencies in these areas. And so I think worldview issues are very critical for us to consider in discussions of history. Now, you mentioned that it sounds like I'm a presuppositionalist in this book. Well, personally, I am a presuppositionalist in my apologetic method. I don't know if I would argue that the heresy of orthodoxy was intentionally presuppositional in its approach, but I think we do touch on things related to that, particularly the issue of worldviews. And so I go back to that as a key point that we need to keep on the table when we have these conversations.
Well said.
Thank you for that. Zach Lacey.
How's it going? This question is for Dr. Kruger. The first sentence in your book, in the introduction, you ask the question, what is truth? And then in the conclusion, your last sentence is, may God have mercy on us all. And so what I appreciate about the book is that, I guess, sort of in your defense of truth, I guess you sort of provide a little proclamation of truth. My question is, do you feel like someone who reads this book would be able to walk away having that question answered to them, what is truth, adequately answered to them? So I guess that's my question.
Oh, thank you for that question. Well, I don't think that we intended to exhaustively deal with the question of what is truth. I think that the issue is really, is Christianity true, or is the emergence of Christianity in a diverse world, does that fact challenge its validity or challenge its truth? And I think what we argued in the book is the existence of diversity, the existence of multiple interpretations of Christianity in the early centuries don't invalidate Christianity as a normative standard for truth. And so that was designed to, of course, not only deal with the historical questions raised by Bauer, but also to offer a level of reassurance to Christians that you can trust that the Christian system you believe has deep roots that go all the way back to the beginning. So in essence, then, I don't think we're going to philosophically in a book like this address every aspect of the what is truth question. I mean, that's a big question that has all kinds of philosophical tentacles to it. But I think we wanted to ask whether you could regard Christianity as something reliable and trustworthy given its origins within a diverse world. And I hopefully we accomplished that.
Thank you. Rachel.
Okay. So, hi, my name's Rachel. I had a question for you, Dr. Kruger. I want to know if you have heard back from Bart Ehrman, if he has read your book, or if you have heard any responses from him.
Thank you for that. You might be surprised. I get that question very often in terms of personal interaction with Dr. Ehrman over this book or some other books I've written or reviews of his books. I can't say that Bart and I interact much personally. We mainly interact in print. I don't know of Bart to be the type of person who responds to really any critiques of his work. He sort of doesn't really engage with those. And maybe I'm sure there's counterexamples that are worth noting, but for the most part, when people review his books, he doesn't really comment. I think Jeff may have had more interactions with him than I have, and so I turn it over to Jeff maybe as an input, or Paul. I don't know if you guys interact with Bart at all. I don't have much of an opportunity to do so.
Yeah, I've had some conversations with Bart Ehrman. We've talked normally about other scholars and their perspectives. I find him to be an extremely cordial and knowledgeable person. But it's very clear that we disagree on our presuppositions and the ways in which we approach the same group of historical data. He is a graduate of my institution, and so we have that association in common. But it's clear, and when we have conversations, it's on the table that we're approaching the data through different lens.
I think David and I saw Dr. Ehrman in England here. It's about well, I guess Jeff was there as well. I think all my conversation was simply hello and sat 2 chairs away from him. I've not done much writing that's directly until just more recently directly related to Professor Ehrman. An article, a very special, significant, not significant, but special, precise issue rather, tied to a textual question in a journal. But frankly, I'm kind of self-aware of my own asking things. He's a top-tier scholar. I would not consider myself to be that, but much more of kind of a secondary scholar or something like that. So I wouldn't really expect him to interact with me necessarily personally. So I don't think it's a fault per se at all on his side. Just being kind of self-aware of my own place in the world type thing. So, so we have had a conversation about a Polycarpian translation issue once at a conference. He had asked me my view about something, but.
Yeah, I'm afraid I have nothing to add to that. I've only had a conversation with him once, and yes, it was in Oxford last month. And there, I did ask him what he was working on because he was coming to the Tertullian sessions. And he reminded me that that's his area of expertise is the 2nd, 3rd century. What I think tends to happen is he gets read in his popular works as talking about the New Testament and the reliability of the New Testament, and that's how we tend to pigeonhole him because of those popular works. But he actually is a very good scholar when it comes to early Christian texts, and I found him to be very cordial as well, even though, as the others have said, I think we probably disagree on a lot of our prior commitments.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Joel.
I was just looking to clarify. In the book, it talks about that the New Testament believers would be expecting a written document to confirm the New Covenant. And like I understand the suzerain vassal, covenant, and that was already kind of a precedent that was set. But would that be something that they would still be expecting, like 1,400 years after the Old Testament, and when the first covenant was given? Would the New Testament believers still be expecting that at that early stage? Would they still be expecting like a written confirmation of it?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, in my opinion, they would, and here's why. No one's arguing, of course, that first century believers are aware of suzerain vassal treaties from Hittite 1,500 or 2,000 years before. That's not the argument. The argument is they would have known of that pattern through the actual Old Testament narrative itself. In other words, they're being immersed in a world committed to the Old Testament scriptures. Their awareness that the Old Testament scriptures were themselves covenantal documents would have already given a first century Jew an understanding that when God covenants, at least in the form that he did with Israel, that he does so with written text. So they wouldn't have had to know Hittite treaties in order to make that connection. And incidentally, this is not just a view that Klein has and others have argued for. Even Adolf von Harnack argued for this view. Harnack, who's by no means an evangelical, made a very clear argument that a new Israel requires a new scripture. and that's exactly what Jesus indicated theologically, at least, that he was coming to set up. And so this is a fairly old connection between written texts and covenants. I just tried in the book to bring it a little more to the surface. As a side note, I cover a little more thoroughly in my book the question of canon. I only had a small portion of it in this particular volume.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Luke.
Thank you so much for the panel today. My question is, it was mentioned before that there's a bias today that is pervasive in academia and in the general public that does not allow for the possibility of the supernatural. What would you say to those who deny the possibility of the supernatural intervention in the creation and preservation of the New Testament texts?
I'm going to encourage the other panelists to jump in here. Jeff contributed to the chapter, or rather book we did on the early text of the New Testament. He may want to comment on this.
Yeah, so I think what's extremely helpful here is for us to recognize that part of our assumptions as evangelicals is that we do believe that the inspired and overseen construction of texts that began clearly in the Old Testament continues into the New, so that the same Spirit that inspired the prophets is the Spirit that is inspiring the apostles. The God who appeared at Mount Sinai is the God incarnate who speaks from the mount and delivers a sermon. So that what we are affirming is that there has been no change in terms of who it is that is sending these scriptures and the means, the divine means or agents through whom he sends them. God is the same, the Spirit is the same, the gospel is the same, and so in the same way in which the Jews would proclaim a supernatural activity in regard to Yahweh's relationship to Israel, the way in which he manifests himself in Israel and preserves the scriptures of Israel through their various historical experiences, that same God is doing precisely the same thing through the church, so that the church is now the body of Christ, through which the good news of Christ is proclaimed and preserved, and that the scriptures which are associated with this new grouping of humanity are also preserved. So in the same way in which God through Israel preserves the scriptures of Israel, God through the body of his Son now preserves the writings of the New Covenant. The parallelism is almost exact, and once again we declare that there is a unity to the history of redemption, to the history of revelation, and to the history of the preservation of sacred texts.
Do any other panelists have anything else they'd like to add to that question or answer?
I think one can splice theologically there too. The question I believe had asked the question in terms of miraculous and supernatural. You could think of the difference between miraculous and providential, for example, in issues of text transmission and so on. I think there has to be acknowledgement of corruptions and so on, and we would all do that in case of the text transmission and so on. So I wouldn't want to make it, the question kind of lumped together, it seemed, the student's question lumped together preservation issues with origin issues, which is limited for inspiration and preservation, which gets the questions of text transmission issues. So I think you just want to be a little bit careful about theologically splicing between some of those issues. The umbrella, I think, would be pneumatological. I would agree with Jeff about that. I think if you look at before the actual New Testament texts are written, though, that there's a Christological center. They're early on speaking in terms of the prophets look forward to Christ, and the apostles, of course, come from Christ. So you see that language, for example, in Polycarp chapter 6, is dealing with persons, prophets looking forward to Christ. And I know this appears in Mike's book, the discussion of apostle, Lord, prophet, Lord, apostle. So there's a Christological side of that too. Of course, we never want to splice between Christological and pneumatological, but there's also a Christ-centered to that as well, which then brings up the central question in my mind would be the supernatural question, but the question of the resurrection. Earlier when the question was asked, what's something that people might agree with, and the statement was made, continuity between Old Testament, what we now call Old Testament scripture, and Jesus and his life and ministry and all that. Seems to me there's also a center point about the risen Lord. I mean, that's interpreted in different ways, and it brings up questions about historiography and physicality and so on. And in that sense, as Jeff brought up, but there is the risen Lord, I think, is a key part of the kerygma that is consistent, and that brings up the questions of normativity type questions that I kind of first began with.
Excellent. Thank you for both those responses. Carrie.
And Chase, can you hear me? Out of respect for our speakers, maybe this should be one of the very last questions so we can release at 9 Pacific Standard Time.
Is this on? Can you see me? Okay, yeah. Hi, I'm Kari, and I have a question. Obviously, but what was I gonna ask? Well, yeah. So how did I know Bart Ehrman? He went to Moody Bible Institute and and he went to Moody and Wheaton. But how did he kind of change from his Christian views and values? What happened and what made him switch over total opposite sides? Did I confuse you? Was that confusing?
Chase, can you hear me? Can you hear me, Chase?
Yes, I can.
Great. If any of the panelists want to address that, that's great. But it's the nature of the question is a personal, and we won't be able to do too much with that. Do any of the panelists wish to address that?
I'll just simply say that Ehrman has given his own testimony to that precise question numerous times in the introduction of almost all his books. So just pick up any Ehrman book and you can read his own account of how he got from point A to point B. And I'll just leave it for him to tell that story.
Great. And if there are any other questions that you know of, Chase, that we need to get to, great. Otherwise, out of respect for our speakers, we should release them promptly.
All right. Any other pressing questions? One more, maybe? All right, one final question.
How's it going? My question would be this. In light of the fact that Bart Ehrman and others are not believers, how should we address them? I know that we're addressing them to defend Christianity, but just in general, how should we view them, address them, that kind of thing, as believers ourselves?
I'll chime in here. I'm not sure exactly what the question's driving at there in terms of how to consider them or treat them. I mean, we would treat them like we would any person, which is with respect and with graciousness and patience. And certainly, if they're a non-Christian, we would look for opportunities to direct them back to Christ as much as possible. You know, for a person like Ehrman, as you know, he's heard the message of Christ numerous times, and so, you know, we would regard him as someone who still needs to hear it, but you know, he's obviously chosen a different path. So it's a bit difficult to know kind of what the question's getting at. I mean, I would say that we would want to regard him and treat him like any non-Christian, looking for opportunities to lovingly share the good news of Jesus with him. You know, part of the reason all of us on this panel do what we do in scholarship is to hopefully to convince him and anyone, truthfully, of the reliability of the Christian message. And so I'll offer that as a final thought. I'm sure my fellow panelists would have their own comments on that.
Well, I'll follow up, Dr. Kruger. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I understood that to be one of the aims of your book is you weren't really speaking to Bart Ehrman, but you were speaking to readers of Ehrman who have doubts and who have lingering questions. And again, I think that was the strength of your work. Is historical Christianity is very reliable. It is you can validate this. You can look at the sources yourself. So I don't know that I have anything to add as far as how to treat Ehrman and others. I had a conversation with him. I treated him like I would want to be treated. So I think we apply the golden rule. And but the conversation that I think is being had here is how do we talk to people who are of faith, but also want to love the Lord not just with all their hearts, but with all their minds. And they're reading good scholarly works, and they're reading history, and they're coming up against some good hard questions. I think that's an important conversation that you, Dr. Kruger, have helped us with, and others on this panel are doing good work in. So I appreciate this conversation.
Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists. Let's go ahead and give them a round of applause. So, students, we're going to take a 15-minute break. Come back at 9:25.
Thank you so much for those of you who joined the panel. I'm very grateful that you speak to our students, and we'll be in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
John.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.
See you guys.
Good to see you all.
See you. Maybe we'll cross paths at ETS and SBL.
Yeah,
Great.
that'd be great.
Hope to see you all.
Blessings.